turn-based combat has been a staple of the RPG genre for about as long as I can remember, and I've usually enjoyed its many incarnations, or at the very worst tolerated it. But I can't really argue with the number of complaints I've seen lodged against this combat system. It's easy for a turn-based combat system to grow stale over dozens of hours of gameplay, especially if steep difficulty spikes encourage grinding. Hello world, my name is Atticus, and welcome to the experiment. Initially, this was going to be a video where I did a brief overview of turn-based combat systems and then hypothesized about possible innovations to the formula and things to keep in mind when designing a turn-based combat system to avoid some of the more common complaints. And then I remembered that I have absolutely no idea what I'm talking about. So what we have today is just the overview, and sometime, eventually, I'll make a part 2 about designing turn-based combat systems for the modern era. First, what do I mean when I say turn-based combat system? The name, fortunately, does much of the heavy lifting when it comes to explaining itself, but let's expand on that as well as set some boundaries. Turn-based combat refers to combat in which the action happens over a number of turns. Most notably, during a turn, only one actor is able to, well, act. The most widely known example I can think of would be the mainline Pokemon games. The player sends out a Pokemon, and the opposing trainer does the same. The player then selects an action, usually an attack, but using an item or switching Pokemon is also an option, as is running away if the opponent is a wild Pokemon. Once the action is selected, the game runs some math and picks one of the Pokemon to act first, though using items and switching Pokemon always takes priority. This cycle continues until all Pokemon on one side have fainted. Now, for something that is turn-based combat, but which we will not be discussing here, we have the combat systems of SRPGs, where not only does the player have to decide what action to use, but where to move in a two-dimensional grid. As we consider a modern-day turn-based system, we should consider the grievances levied against the systems of old. The biggest of those are the system's repetitive nature and the unrealism of that kind of combat. There is a fair amount to unpack in regards to repetition, so let's begin with the unrealism. Imagine a fight with some generic fantasy monster or a band of bloodthirsty bandits. It's probably not a civil affair, but rather a hectic struggle to survive, chaotic and messy. In turn-based combat, and to a lesser extent the active time variance, it's far calmer. The actors engaged in combat stand in their respective sides of the room and take turns hitting each other. And very few games attempt to contextualize this. In fact, several games feature a transition screen, taking us away from the rest of the gameplay experience to now do combat in this new space, separate from everything else. There is, however, at least one game which contextualizes this style of combat in a fantastic way: Yakuza Like a Dragon. In this game, the main character is a fan of the Dragon Quest series, RPGs which have been quite innovative in the turn-based combat space. And as an extension of that, the main character imagines fights that they get into through the lens of a Dragon Quest game. Another character even remarks on how the protagonist allows their enemies to hit them. And that is such a fantastic way to contextualize an abstraction of combat. If such a combat system needs contextualizing in the first place, though, the question becomes, why is combat handled that way? The answer comes from Dungeons & Dragons. Tabletop role-playing games abstract combat out of a necessity absent in video games. In the 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons, for example, players roll for initiative, which determines in what order the actors in combat take their turns. This models an actor's reaction speed. Once the fighting breaks out, how quickly can they respond? From there, every turn consists of a movement, an action, and a bonus action. And every round, that is, every time all actors have taken a turn, is representative of 6 seconds. So in the fiction, all movements, actions, bonus actions, and reactions, which can happen if certain conditions are met on another actor's turn, those are all happening at the same time. But in the actual gameplay, the actions play out sequentially. This is important because some of the first RPGs, such as Ultima, took inspiration from this style of gameplay and adopted turn-based combat, and then other games, like Dragon Quest, took inspiration from those games, and then all other RPGs followed in Dragon Quest's footsteps, carrying turn-based combat into the pervasive element of RPGs that it is. Repetition on its own is not a bad thing. We have, in fact, an entire video on why repetition can be a good thing. It can also be a very bad thing, as evidenced with some of the complaints about turn-based combat. And that is another complaint that makes a lot of sense. Turn-based combat is most commonly found in RPGs that run for dozens of hours, and that's a lot of time over which a combat system can grow stale. The largest perpetrators of souring combat are, in my opinion, grinding and simple optimal strategies. The former encourages optimization. Again, not something bad all on its own, but in this case that optimization usually results in finding the best place to get the most experience as fast as possible. And that means running the same fights repeatedly until a certain milestone is hit. I imagine most people would agree that it's not a pleasant gameplay experience, and it ties into the latter, simple optimal strategy. If all combat encounters can be easily solved with minimal impact to the player character's health by using the basic attack action, why not do that? It conserves the use of special abilities and items in most cases and gets the job done all the same. But it takes away from turn-based combat's greatest strength, strategic thinking. In Pokemon and Persona, most enemies have a weakness which can be exploited to deal more damage, and many turn-based combat systems feature ways to temporarily buff one's allies, debuff foes, and both apply and remove status conditions. There is a lot of space in these systems for interesting and varied combat encounters, but more often than not, a battle, and indeed an entire game, can be won without ever having to engage with those systems. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. Let's talk about bars of entry and skill ceilings. I'm going to use Dark Souls 3 to illustrate the former because this is my video and I can. The game starts you off in the Cemetery of Ash and teaches you the controls via developer messages littered throughout the area. A few weak enemies are scattered to practice those controls on, and then you reach the boss of the area, Udix Gundyr. The rest of the game cannot be accessed until Gundyr is defeated, making him the bar of entry for Dark Souls 3. A player must be good enough to beat this boss before they are able to enjoy all of the other bosses blocking progression. In the context of a turn-based system, the bar of entry is not how big the numbers on the characters are, but how well a player understands a combat system. The more a player has to engage with the complexities of a given system, the higher the bar. Conversely, a skill ceiling is the extent of a system's complexity, and how good a player can get at working within it. To go back to the origins of these systems, consider the difference between a fighter and a wizard in combat for the 5th edition's Dungeons & Dragons. The fighter has fewer combat options than the wizard, resulting in both a lower bar of entry and a lower skill ceiling. Just about all of the interesting choices for a fighter happen before combat breaks out. What weapon is the character wielding? Do they have a backup or maybe both melee and ranged options? What armor are they utilizing? Before combat, a wizard also has interesting choices to make in regards to what spells they have prepared, but in combat, the answer is not a simple number of damage dice or armor class, but which spell works best for a given situation. On account of the wide variety of spells and sheer number of them, the wizard has more interesting choices to make as compared to the fighter, who usually picks the weapon and armor with the biggest numbers. Speaking of interesting choices in this manner, it may come across that I think wizard to be a better class than fighter, and that's not the case. They fill different roles and fill them well, and while I have shown my hand, we'll get to the matter of interesting choices in a bit. For now, I would like to wrap up bars of entry and skill ceilings. A game with a higher bar of entry is going to turn away more players at the gate. Turning on a game and immediately being bombarded with menus, walls of text, and complex systems is overwhelming. Conversely, lowering that bar too much can make the game seem bland and uninteresting. I recently checked out Adelaide Ryza, Everdarkness and the Secret Hideout, and the introduction to combat in that game is what got me started thinking about engaging turn-based combat, but not in a flattering way. The combat does get more interesting as more options become available, it just takes a bit to get there. What with the state of backlogs everywhere, a good first impression is vital in keeping a player engaged with your game. Likewise, as the game progresses and the player becomes ever better at playing it, if the player reaches the skill ceiling too soon, and the only way to get better at the game is making the numbers go higher, the game can begin to lose its luster. The player has, at that point, essentially solved the game, much like tic-tac-toe. And if that player is anything like myself, they'll soon drop it in favor of something more engaging. Many games circumvent that scenario by having something else going on, be it a narrative element, a collectathon, or just some fun minigames to break up the flow. But with how pervasive combat tends to be, it's a band-aid more than it is a fix. There are definitely good ways to design turn-based combat systems, as evidenced by the fact that I enjoy so many of them. But there are equally many, if not more, pitfalls that these systems can fall into. But that discussion will have to wait for part 2. This has been a rambling of thoughts about turn-based combat systems and just a touch of research. Join us next time for more ramblings and maybe more research. Until then, however, I have been Atticus, and thank you for participating.